Hello and welcome to Asia Stream, where we track, report and analyze the issues and interests of the world's largest region. I am Waj Khan. Today's episode, the struggle for Myanmar. A year ago, Myanmar's military, the Tatmadaw, arrested the country's elected leadership and declared an emergency. Aung San Suu Kyi, the democracy activist turned Nobel Peace Prize laureate turned elected premier, was imprisoned. The next day, the protests began. As they picked up momentum, the military, which has ruled Myanmar directly or indirectly for decades, cracked down. The tear gassing turned into rubber bullets, and those were upgraded to live ammunition, used against those who dared to march for democracy. By last summer, the protests became violent, as many took up arms. As for the military, well, it doubled down and even started using airstrikes to crush those who challenged it. Today, more than 600 groups are operating in the cities and across the countryside. Thousands have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been forced to flee their homes. The UN says 1 in every 4 people needs humanitarian aid.
The country has been dragged back 2 decades.
I think the people out there are just absolutely determined to fight to the end.
Will Myanmar return to democracy? Will the military regime back down? Will the international community step in? Will a new generation of leaders emerge? And is this civil war? That and more are coming up. But before we start, a quick reminder that Nikkei Asia is currently offering an exclusive discount for our podcast listeners. Just type in the code AsiaStream, all caps, no spaces, at checkout when you visit us at asia.nikkei.com. You're listening to the sound of Asia, streaming in your ear. From Nikkei Asia, this is Asia Stream. Those sounds of silence were captured by a Nikkei Asia reporter earlier this week on the streets of Yangon, Myanmar's largest city, as millions protested against a year of military rule with a silent strike. A year ago, on the 1st of February, a workout video that went viral got on tape the military moving in to seize power and arrest the country's elected leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi, also known as Daw Suu. By the 2nd of February, the first sounds of resistance had emerged as people across the country clanged their pots and pans to protest. A year later, the people of Myanmar seem determined to fight on to restore the democratic government they elected in 2020. Some of them are engaged in civil disobedience and mass protests. Some of them have picked up arms. Some of them have left, taking refuge next door.
Those wounded in the crossfire have come across to Thailand for treatment, as have thousands of refugees, a number that's growing every day.
The human cost of what is effectively a civil war has been staggering. 12,000 civilians, soldiers, and combatants killed. Countless thousands detained. At least 400,000 displaced. But the escalation of violence, which now includes bombings by the resistance and airstrikes by the military, clearly indicates that 1 year after the generals took over, many in Myanmar refused to return to the military rule that they lived under for half a century. However, the response of the international community has been mixed. The US has condemned the military and its brutality and, along with the UK and Canada, has announced fresh sanctions against its leadership just this week.
Today, I've approved a new executive order enabling us to immediately sanction the military leaders who directed the coup, their business interests, as well as close family members.
Meanwhile, Myanmar's allies, China and Russia, have thwarted any attempt to sanction the regime and have in fact continued to provide diplomatic and military support. As a shadow government has emerged, regional actors have been divided about how to deal with the regime. Earlier this week, the UN's Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar, Tom Andrews, said it bluntly. Myanmar's military is engaged in war crimes.
The military is committing crimes against humanity and war crimes against the people of Myanmar. And the world must recognize that behind the growing statistics, real people are suffering.
So let's dive in and learn more from someone who was just there on the ground. Here with us and recently back from her reporting trip to Myanmar is Gwen Robinson. Gwen was chief editor of Nikkei Asia back when we were known as the Nikkei Asian Review. Now she's our editor-at-large and she's also a senior fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, where she specializes in Myanmar and the larger Southeast Asia region. Before her work with Nikkei, she spent many years covering Asia for our affiliate, the Financial Times. Gwen, welcome to Asia Stream.
Thanks very much, Wat.
All right, so Gwen, you wrote a brilliant piece for Asia Insight, which is one of our main sections this week. And at the beginning, you say that as life in Yangon settles into a surreal new normal, there is a curiously calm feeling downtown that at first glance belies the fear and violence gripping much of Myanmar. Now, that is an alarming perspective. Tell us more.
Well, I think what I was really trying to convey in that first paragraph was really more the feeling of disconnect, the kind of bizarre calm or semblance of normality that's in Yangon, the former capital, which is now the commercial hub of Myanmar, where, you know, the shopping malls are full of people by the day, and in the evening there's bars and restaurants, including hip new dating spots and things like that. So it all looks, you know, surreally kind of normal, except that below the surface there's a lot of fear, tension, and a slightly sinister air. And that was meant to contrast with what is actually, you know, outright terror, military brutality, and despair in a lot of rural areas around Myanmar.
Right. Now, Gwen, for those of us who aren't familiar, or rather as familiar with Myanmar as you are, I understand that this is definitely not the first military regime in that country. But how would you assess it? How are things different this time around versus your experience and understanding of military governments before this one?
Right. Well, you know, Myanmar is no stranger to military rule and also very harsh, secretive regimes. This time, I think, though, it's unprecedented what we're seeing, which is a convergence of all kinds of opposition. So what I tried to highlight in my visit to one of the border regions in Myanmar's east bordering Thailand was the convergence of forces where you have ethnic armed groups, indigenous ethnic people who have long been fighting the military, teaming up with a lot of activists who have fled to the jungles and taken up arms to actually fight the military. And then more broadly, you've got a lot of civilian uprisings, boycotts, a lot of civil servants who've gone what they call CDM, civil disobedience movement, to leave their jobs and resist the military.
Right. So from this very, I must say, this very Gandhian civil disobedience movement to these men and women who have taken up arms in the jungles of the country. From my understanding and your reporting, there's over 650 PDF groups, so People's Defense Forces groups, which are spread countrywide. But this wasn't the first knee-jerk reaction of the people, right? A year ago, at this time, there were peaceful protests. What do you think, and when do you think was the tipping point when violence became an option, or for some of these groups, the only option for taking on the military regime?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Raj. It's difficult to exactly pinpoint, but we could say it was striking that I interviewed quite a few of these so-called PDFs, People's Defence Force fighters, And invariably, they all, they're quite young, a lot of them, but some of them are up to 40 years old. But all of them were civilians in jobs ranging from salesman to a seaman, merchant seaman, as well as all kinds of a tech entrepreneur. And these are all people who'd never really handled a gun. And they all started off as peaceful protesters in the weeks following the February 1st coup in 2021. And I think that it was really the tipping points were a couple of very harsh military crackdowns, including a particular day in April where near Yangon, the military shot 81 or 82 protesters dead who were peaceful protesters at barricades, maybe throwing rocks.
On the morning of April 9th, people in Myanmar woke up to terrifying messages flooding their social media. In the city of Bago, just 55 miles northeast of Yangon, a massacre was unfolding.
Terror on the streets of Myanmar. This is now the norm.
Overseas now, protests against the military coup, claiming more lives in Myanmar.
So a couple of the PDFs I spoke to were actually in the protest, lost a lot of friends. There are a lot who've lost family and have decided that there's no alternative. It's actually, I think, shaping up to be a lost generation, these sort of people who are flocking to these defense forces. And that estimate, by the way, of 650 groups comes from a couple of research groups which try and track the new growth, the rapid growth of these groups, and they all come out with different names. Some form and then reform and fall apart and then merge with others. So at any point, I think it's a bit of a moving feast. But it would easily be, as you mentioned from my articles, about 650 at any one time, with names as bizarre as, kind-hearted boneheads is the name of one such group, or thunderstorm without borders. They a lot of them do have these fanciful names, but they're deadly serious. They lack arms and ammunition, but I think a lot of these groups get hold of a few guns and are willing to share them. A lot of them use explosives to blow up infrastructure or military convoys. So that's the kind of scenario we're seeing in these pockets of resistance.
And what about the establishment itself, right? I mean, the empire has, in a way, struck back. A year ago or so, in the early days of the regime, the leadership, the military leadership was promising elections. Are those still on the agenda? That's one. And then secondly, how is the military responding to the kind-hearted boneheads of the world? How are they taking these men and women on?
Well, indeed. I mean, that is one of the funniest names, and it's not actually a laughing matter, as I think you pick up on that. It's just, actually in covering Myanmar, you do come across these moments of black humor, which come up also in the extraordinary art and cartoons that are coming out. But
of course,
you ask a couple of very good questions. So the military is cracking down in unimaginable ways. Reports of torture, a lot of detentions, and of course it's escalating because any action by the People's Defence Forces invites some terrible reprisals. Often the fallout is on civilians, and we're seeing whole villages razed to the ground, and so it's a pretty dismal situation.
Now, Gwen, in the past year, there have been around 12,000 or so deaths on all sides of the conflict, including civilians and combatants. So the question really is the violence too entrenched to expect a peaceful solution anytime soon? Has too much damage been done? And then the second question is, how is the region responding? Because I remember a year ago, ASEAN was split about Myanmar, right? There were some countries in the organization which wanted to help, and there were some countries in ASEAN which were not interested in talking to the Myanmar generals at all. So where does the region come in at this point?
Right, you do ask difficult questions, Raj, but they're very good ones. And I'd say first, your your question about the response, or your reference to the two sides, it has to be really emphasized here when we talk about violence on both sides. Initially, there was violence only on one side. The protests were purely peaceful. The fact that people now are trying to push back has been met with extraordinary disproportionate force. So you've got the military now employing helicopters and jet fighters to bomb villages, aerial bombardments, as well as ground forces with huge firepower and the complete deadly will to use it against often unarmed civilians. So it's a very asymmetrical picture there. And in terms of the response, ASEAN, as you say, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is deeply divided, as is the top recognized international body in the world, the United Nations Security Council, which is absolutely split over the response, with China and Russia, firm allies of the military in Myanmar, the military regime, blocking any attempt to even establish, say, an arms embargo or a no-fly zone. Those sort of proposals have been put in place, and any attempts to put more pressure on the military to end the violence. So I think what we've got is a very divided international community and region, it has to be said, which is forcing, I think, a reassessment of ASEAN's whole framework of principle of centrality and non-interference in each other's affairs. And now we're seeing some serious debate, and possibly, I mean, some have called for Myanmar to actually be suspended from ASEAN, which is unthinkable. It would be the first time in ASEAN's history that these sort of issues have been discussed.
Right. Gwen, let's talk a little more about China, which is the elephant in the room. Not only a neighbor which has a border with Myanmar, but also the only superpower which remains in the area, with plans for the Belt and Road Initiative in Myanmar and the region. And Beijing, of course, has had a very different approach to Myanmar compared to the Americans. No sanctions have been issued by China. In fact, Beijing blocked a UN Security Council statement even condemning the military takeover. So the question is, will Beijing stay open for business with whomsoever is in power? Or, considering what we've been talking about, could that blow back?
Well, that's a good point. China is a long-standing ally and friend of Myanmar and previous regimes, but that has to include, and it has to be said, that in the last 5 years of when Aung San Suu Kyi, the de facto leader of Myanmar, has been in power, China actually cozied up to her National League for Democracy government. And I guess China itself was probably not overly thrilled to see the military take over, and also not that China has shown any concern about human rights per se, but I think they are concerned that this terrible scale of violence and the pushback it has invited is actually spoiling their backyard a bit, because its long border with Myanmar, it's very sensitive about, and it has oil and gas interests, including some very precious pipelines for China running from Western Myanmar, offshore Western Myanmar, through to Yunnan province. So they're very concerned, I think, about their infrastructure and, prospects that their interests will be harmed. And I think right now what China really wants is stability. And there actually is, in China's view, no alternative at the moment apart from a very strong military that could hold the country together. But increasingly, I think there's doubts about whether this supposedly strong military can hold the country together, because I think the people out there are just absolutely determined to fight to the end.
Right. And, well, I was going to say, Gwen, that this isn't your first rodeo, as the Americans say. This is not your first military regime, military government in Myanmar. But if one were to ask you about a crystal ball analysis in the next 12 months, where do you see things going?
Well, that's the $64 million question. And a lot of people, I think the resistance movement, which is quite, in a way, very disparate. There's one thing they agree on is that the military regime must be ousted. But the very divisive question is is there any room for negotiation if the military regime decided to try and negotiate? And I think increasingly hardliners are saying no. So if I had to guess, I would say in a year's time, we're going to see further fragmentation in Myanmar and possibly the cities settling into this surreal kind of uneasy kind of calm where the cities are carrying on. But in the countryside, I think you're going to see increasing, basically civil war and various ranges of activity and pushback. So it's not a happy scenario, and I really can't see the military coming to the negotiating table. And even if the military wanted to, I can't see a lot of the resistance wanting to talk to the military. They want to fight to the end. And some of them are increasingly thinking that maybe they can win. But it's hard to say right now with the enormous firepower of the military that a people's force can prevail. We did see it in the Vietnam War where the Vietnamese troops defeated the American-led forces against impossible odds. So never say never, I would say.
Interesting. Well, Gwen Robinson, thank you for keeping us honest about Myanmar and coming on Asia Stream.
Thank you very much, Rich.
A bit of a bleak note to end on, but we have a couple of hopeful points coming up too from a Burmese journalist who intimately knows Myanmar's problems and potential. We're here with Thin Lei Win, a Nikkei Asia contributor, co-founder of the non-profit Kite Tiles and former chief correspondent of Myanmar Now, a news agency based in Yangon. Thin, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Raj.
All right, now, Thin, you've said that a common misconception about Myanmar is that it went from being perfectly peaceful to conflict-ridden overnight. What do you mean by that?
Well, so essentially, one of the things that I am constantly being asked over the past 12 months is that, is Myanmar now going to be mired in civil war? Or, like you said, Myanmar was such a peaceful nation. We have all these pagodas and, pictures of monks. Now there's all this violence. What's happening? And that is a very common misconception. Unfortunately, Myanmar is home to some of the world's longest running civil wars. Armed conflict has been in existence for at least 70 years. It is just that they were in the peripheries of the country. They were in the hilly areas. They were in the border regions. They were in areas where you've got the minority ethnic groups. So people in big cities and towns in the Central Plains didn't really see it firsthand. And that also meant that the international community did not see it or experience it firsthand. It's just that violence is now spilling over into where we could all see and in fact follow in real time.
On that front, Thin, you founded Kite Tales, a project that collects the stories of ordinary Burmese folk. So, if I may, what have you heard from them about the deteriorating humanitarian situation on the ground?
We set up the Kite Tales, me and another journalist friend, during the heyday of Myanmar's opening in 2016, when it felt like, the sky was the limit. Millions of people were suddenly online. They discovered the internet, journalism and local media was flourishing. There was, foreign investment coming in. And now just, 5-6 years later, it's a complete reversal. The country has been dragged back 2 decades. People are now living in isolation and fear. Internet is very tightly regulated and controlled. The economy is in tatters. People are afraid. Like, imagine walking on the streets of Myanmar these days. You can be stopped at any point by the junta, the military, the soldiers. They would check your phone, and if they see pictures or information that they do not like, you could be arrested and you could be tortured. In fact, some say that people have died as a result. This is the kind of situation that people are having to live through. In addition, the humanitarian needs are vast. They're just enormous. The latest report, humanitarian needs report from the UN, said that 14.4 million people needs humanitarian assistance. That is 1 in 4 people.
So Thin, between Thailand, Cambodia, the Philippines, Laos, etc., most of the region has recently been struggling with autocracy or been entrenched in it. But it still seems that what has been happening in Myanmar for the last 6 decades or so is on another level, with the perpetual ethnic conflict, the endemic poverty, and the military regime after military regime. Why is it, if I may ask, why is it that Myanmar is in such a particularly unenviable spot in Southeast Asia?
There was obviously the colonial legacy. Myanmar was under colonization first by the British and then the Japanese, and then British came back in. It's a fairly young country. Myanmar is a very diverse nation. It is estimated that the Burma, the majority ethnic group, makes up about 2/3, but the other 1/3 is made up of lots and lots of different groups with different cultures and language and traditions. And of course, this divide and rule strategy that the British colonial masters have deployed had a massive impact on national unity. One thing that we have seen over the past 12 months is this massive shift within the Myanmar society, and we have never been as united as we've been over the past 12 months. There is the common enemy is the military now, and the Burma Buddhists, the majority group that used to have the privilege and not really understood or believed what the minority ethnic groups have been going through, the discrimination, the oppression. They are realizing what has been happening right under their nose for the past 70 years.
That's interesting. So is this a tipping point? Is this when the people of Myanmar finally start to see themselves as a single nation rather than a collection of ethnic groups?
I absolutely hope so. As you so eloquently put it, I absolutely hope this is the tipping point. Obviously, it is going to take a lot longer, and there needs to be a lot more reflection from the part of the Burma Buddhist majority to which I belong. For many decades, the propaganda, the military propaganda has been very successful, right? They've sort of put themselves and the Burma majority as the benevolent brothers. This whole idea of a family, but we are the big brothers and we are looking after the younger brothers who are naughty and troublesome. This is how they portrayed the minority ethnic groups as. And that's how a lot of the Burma Buddhists saw the ethnic armed groups. You could see very clearly with what happened with the Rohingya when there were these atrocities, that happened in 2017. And you've got, within, I think, a month of these attacks, state-sponsored attacks, you've got more than 700,000 Rohingyas, fleeing across the border from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and there were all these terrible stories of rape and abuse and villages being burned down, and the military, was constantly saying, "Oh no, they did it to themselves. These are untrue. These are fake news." So, having witnessed it themselves, they're finally realizing that, there was a reason why ethnic armed groups came into being, that perhaps all these propaganda that they had been listening to perhaps were probably wrong.
Now, Thin, to wrap up, let's look forward. If Aung San Suu Kyi is not released, or even if she is there a plan for what comes next and who comes next? Is a new generation of leadership emerging, an alternative to the military regime?
Oh, I am in awe of the Generation Z, and Generation Y as well, because, those are the two generations that were leading the protests, the creative, very, very creative and brave protests, and also leading the current resistance, both the armed and the peaceful resistance. Do Suu has been synonymous with Myanmar for many, many years. Unfortunately, she's currently in jail and she can't speak. We don't know what she's thinking. She has fallen from grace in the international arena because of her failure to essentially speak out when the atrocities were being committed against the Rohingya. But she is still extremely popular within the country. And people, I think, at least ordinary people and voters are still hoping for some sort of guidance from her. Now, having said all of that, there are a number of really brave protesters, activists, leaders that have come up from what has happened over the past 12 months. And I'm very heartened by how inclusive and diverse they are. So you might think I'm prevaricating by not naming individual people. And part of this is, and it is intentional, because I think for so long, Myanmar has been twinned with a single person, Do Suu, that I think we really need to move away from a single leader.
Thin Lei Win, thank you for being on Asia Stream, and we really hope you stay safe as well. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
On Thursday, the Burmese regime announced yet another change against Suu Kyi, this time for bribery. She's already on trial in almost a dozen cases that, when combined, carry maximum prison sentences for at least 150 years. That's the latest, and that's it for Asia Stream this week. As always, I encourage you to head to Nikkei Asia at asia.nikkei.com for more in-depth coverage of Myanmar and, of course, the rest of Asia. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share, subscribe, and leave us a review and hopefully a 5-star rating. And a reminder that Nikkei Asia is currently offering an exclusive discount for our podcast listeners. Just type in the code AsiaStream, all caps, no spaces, at checkout on asia.nikkei.com. This episode was produced by Monica Hunter-Hart and Jack Stone Truitt. I'm your host, Waj Khan. Let's cross streams next week.